In January 2020, the literary world was abuzz as the T.S. Eliot estate finally unlocked a treasure trove of over 1,000 letters written by the renowned poet to his little-known American muse, Emily Hale. These letters, long kept from public view, sparked new discussions about Hale's influence on Eliot's work. But the central question remained, who exactly was Emily Hale? Retired journalist Sara Fitzgerald set out to answer this in her groundbreaking biography, The Silenced Muse, Emily Hale, T.S. Eliot, and the Role of a Lifetime.
A lot of scholars believe that he created her as a Beatrice to his Dante in his mind and putting her on a pedestal, which I think she sort of felt as well in terms of if you read the letters that he wrote to her at the time. I wanted to flesh out who she was as a person so it wouldn't be defined solely by her relationship with Eliot.
Drawing from those long embargoed letters and years of meticulous research, Fitzgerald paints a vivid portrait of Hale as a gifted actress, director, and educator who navigated personal trials to build a career at prominent American colleges. As Eliot's confidant, she helped shape his early ventures into playwriting, leaving a lasting mark on his artistic journey.
Going back to the theater work, you learn from the letters that she actually gave him a lot of advice when he shifted to playwriting in the 1930s. And he actually made a comment of, I want to write plays because I want to impress you. But then he kind of flipped at the end. The day the letters were open, a shock came because it turned out back in 1960, Eliot had sent a secret letter to Harvard with instructions that it be released the same day Emily Hale's letters became public. And in this, he was frankly very nasty and critical. He said, I never really loved her. It was the love of a ghost for a ghost. One of the things I wanted to do in my book was to quote from the letters as much as I could. I like for people to be able to read exactly what Eliot wrote to her and then decide for themselves.
And Sara Fitzgerald, thank you very much for coming with us today.
Thanks very much for having me, Rod.
So I had a really interesting time reading your book about Emily Hale. I can't claim that I knew that much, if anything, about Emily Hale.
Your experience was kind of my own. I only found out about Emily Hale in about 2015. And I found out about her because a friend of mine, I was a member of a small women's group that met monthly, and the hostess picked the discussion topic. And she said, I had long admired this poem that T.S. Eliot wrote called Burnt Norton, and I'd like to have us read it and discuss it. And I had never, read the poem. So I did sort of what we all might do. I went to the internet, did a Google search, and up popped a Wikipedia entry. And in it explained that Burnt Norton was an abandoned manor home and gardens in the Cotswolds of England, and that Eliot had taken a walk there with a woman named Emily Hale back in the mid-1930s. Went on to explain that some scholars said that he would have married Emily Hale if he had not already been married to someone. And at the time, I knew about Eliot's two wives, his first wife, Vivian. There had been a somewhat controversial movie called Tom and Viv that came out about their relationship a few years before this. And I also knew about his second wife, Valerie, who was younger than he was. She had been his secretary, and she managed his literary estate up until the time she died. But I knew nothing about Emily Hale, and so I started digging a little bit deeper and was immediately intrigued when I learned that in about 5 years, more than 1,000 letters that Eliot wrote Hale over the course of their lifetime. Times were due to be released after a 50-year embargo by Princeton University Library. I'd written a few novels before this, and I had admired books like The Paris Wife about Hadley Hemingway, Loving Frank about Mama Borthwick, the lover of Frank Lloyd Wright. And so I thought, well, this presents an interesting possibility for a novel because we didn't know enough about her to be able to do a full-fledged biography at that time. So I set out to do the research. There was obviously a lot written about T.S. Eliot, but had to imagine some scenes. I tried to always keep within the bounds of what was possible or plausible in terms of where we knew Eliot was at a particular time or where we knew she was. And so then in 2020, right before the letters became opened, I actually managed to get my novel, The Poet's Girl, published. So after all that, I decided I had to be at Princeton University the day the letters were opened.
Was that a common practice of people of letters of that day, where they might have letters that go back and forth between different partners and they decide to have them open up after they had passed X amount of time? Or was that kind of an unusual thing because he was an unusually well-celebrated Nobel Prize-winning poet?
I think it varied. I think what biographers of women have found is a lot of time women destroyed their letters because they didn't want to reveal their private most thoughts. But going back to Eliot, there had been a suggestion that Hale had donated the letters to Princeton out of an angry vindictiveness after Eliot married his secretary, which was a surprise to all of his friends and associates, right? But when you got into the letters, it became clear that it was Eliot who had pushed Hale to keep the correspondence, and he wanted it, he said at the time, to be joined up with hers years later as a monument, a testament to their love. And she was a little bit more cautious about it. She knew they'd been talking about private things, and she said, well, maybe can't you just pull out the things that scholars might be interested in? But then in the end, I think she was proud of their relationship, and that was one of the things that motivated her to give them to Princeton. But one of the sad things was that after she did that, and she actually wrote Eliot and said, the scholars would like to have my side of the correspondence, and it was later confirmed that he, in fact, destroyed her side, which is one of the reasons why I titled the book The Silenced Muse, because he, in effect, did silence her.
Having read through the book and their relationship, he seemed very involved, and she didn't seem so much interested in him. And over the course of the book and over the course of their two lives, it seems like toward the end things kind of switched. He kind of pushed her off to the side rather brusquely, to be polite, in the end. And she seemed more interested in continuing and deepening the relationship. Did I read that correctly or no?
I think so. One of the things we were happy to discover when the papers were opened is she had left behind 2 short memoirs of their relationship. She had written a more detailed one, but then out of sympathy for Eliot's widow, she retrieved it and had that destroyed. But in one of these memoirs, she said that Eliot had told her that he loved her before he left for England when he was a graduate student at Harvard, but he didn't actually propose. And she said that she was sort of surprised and embarrassed when he declared his love for her. He was a very shy, bumbling kind of person, and when you recall the dates they actually had, that comes through in the letters. But she said, well, he wrote me, he sent me flowers when I was having theatrical appearances and all, and so she started to think, well, we'll see what happens when he comes back. But then he surprised all of his family and friends by deciding to marry the English woman who became his first wife. He told Hale later that after about a year of his marriage, he decided he had made a mistake and that he was really still in love with her. But later in 1932, he came to Harvard on a year-long fellowship. And it was during that year he went to visit Hale when she was teaching at Scripps College in California.
Right.
And I think when they had that longer face-to-face time together, they both fell in love in a different kind of way. And Eliot resolved, I'm going to seek a legal separation from my wife. It's going to be challenging, but when I get back to England, that's what I'm going to do.
I'd like to put this a little bit more in context. Let's talk a bit about Eliot and a little bit about Hale and their backgrounds as well, because T.S. Eliot, we're here in St. Louis. He was born in St. Louis. His grandfather started Washington University, but eventually he went back east where a lot of family was. Is that correct?
Yes.
And it's almost the same with Emily Hale. They were both not born in Boston where they ended up meeting.
Yeah, they were both born outside of Boston, but they came from families that were certainly linked to Boston society. And Hale's father and uncle were fairly prominent Unitarian ministers, as were some of Eliot's relatives. And so they were both members of a class in early 20th century Boston that was centered around Harvard and Cambridge and Unitarianism. We believe they met because she was a childhood friend of Eliot's cousin. And the Eliot family used to go to Gloucester, Massachusetts in the summer and vacation together to get away from the heat of St. Louis. And
That's fair enough.
They might have met as children, but we know for sure that they met as, young or late teenagers. Eliot went east. He went to Milton Academy as preparation for going into Harvard, which most of his family members had done. They were in a circle of friends who liked to act. And Eliot said in some of his early letters that he remembered a particular game of charades night at one of their mutual friends' house. And as he said it, I tripped over your foot and immediately fell in love with you. But then he kind of flipped at the end, and the day the letters were opened, a shock came because it turned out back in 1960, Eliot had sent a secret letter to Harvard with instructions that it be released the same day Emily Hale's letters became public. And in this, he was, frankly very nasty and critical. He said, I never really loved her. It was the love of a ghost for a ghost. She didn't like my poetry. If I'd married her, I never would have become the great poet I was. She didn't have good taste. She loved her uncle more than she loved me. By the way, I never had any sex with that woman, kind of an echo of Bill Clinton's, or it's a Bill Clinton later echo of his words. And he also confirmed that he destroyed her letters. And so coming as it did, we were sitting there reading these letters, which were clearly love letters. And then here came this other letter, which was totally the opposite of what we were reading at the time. And ironically, the fact that he sent that letter had the impact of drawing more attention to the opening of her letters. It kind of arrived at the height of the Me Too movement. And so, again, there was a lot of this sense of a powerful man who had been involved in some way with a woman but had, in effect, squelched her voice. And so while the letters probably would have eventually got a lot of attention because of their content, the initial spin was that this sort of he said, she said soap opera story. And suddenly people like public television and Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal were all writing about it.
What do you think? Because you've seen the original letters. Do you think he just used her literally as a muse and was just kind of stringing her along? Because at least through your telling, he did have another relationship-ish with another woman in the UK before he got remarried after his first wife died. Where do you think there's any truth to that, or do you think he was just trying to cover bases because he was just old and got old and grumpy or what have you?
I think he's obviously a very complicated personality. And I think as people have learned more about his life, I think a lot of scholars sort of feel, I can't support what he did as a person, but I can still admire his poetry. I think he, again, had difficult relationships, with women, was emotionally repressed in many ways. One of the things I wanted to do in my book was to quote from the letters as much as I could. The Eliot estate actually controls access to them, and so, if you want to quote from the letters and you're doing a popular book, you have to make arrangements with them. I like for people to be able to read exactly what Eliot wrote to her and then decide for themselves. I think some people feel that there were points in their relationship where Emily Hale should have had the strength to say enough of this and walk away, and, you're stringing me along, or you're making life difficult for me emotionally. But at that point in her life, I think she appreciated she had this friendship with someone who was obviously an intelligent person and had gone back many years. They had developed a lot of deep feelings for each other. And I think, she felt he's still my friend. And it's interesting when you read the letters in the 1950s after he had told her, I'm not going to marry you, after all her years of waiting. It was more, I felt, like the letters I would send to some of my friends now as a senior. Our travels, our health problems. I visited a mutual friend and wanted to tell you about it. And so they had much more of that character. But then she was totally shocked when he suddenly married his secretary. And she wrote to her friend kind of, well, he's just proved he's he's another old man who fell in love with a younger woman. One of the things, kind of from my perspective as a journalist and historian, I was always interested in what else was going on in society at the time. And one of the things that intrigued me was that Eliot married his secretary about 5 months after Arthur Miller married Marilyn Monroe. Okay. So here again, you had another famous playwright becoming involved with a younger woman. Same sort of paparazzi following them at the time of those marriages. And so that was kind of an interesting little sidelight.
What do you think about Emily Hale? What do you think her life was like outside of the letters that you saw? Or were you able to kind of glean anything from the letters, or did you know anything about her life? Do you think she was only devoted to T.S. Eliot, as can be seen through the letters, of course, because that's what we're looking at? But do you think she did, none of it's mentioned, but do you think she also had other possible love interests or what have you? I guess in the parlance of today, she would have been a childless cat lady. I mean, if you could describe her as that.
Or childless dog lady, as it turned out.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Let's not worry about accuracy when we're talking about that. But
yeah, I think, well, one of the reasons I was interested in doing the book is I felt that some of the Eliot biographers, either because of stereotypes or because of information that was available at the time, had cast that Hale and the other woman who had been Eliot's companion late in life had pretty much had nervous breakdowns, fallen apart after he married his secretary. And I found that not to be the case. One of the privileges I had was connecting to women who had been some of Emily Hale's last high school students and attended their 60th high school reunion from Abbott Academy, which is now part of Phillips Andover. And so one of my key questions was they had known Hale in the 6 months after Eliot got remarried, and then she reached the mandatory retirement age and had to leave. So it wasn't that she had left the school because she had fallen apart. She had to retire. And so I would say to them, did you notice any change in your teacher? Did she seem to fall apart? And the answer was no, they were all oblivious to it. And in fact, Hale, there was an immediate incident after she retired when she went over to England and made contact with Eliot. But again, I felt that had more nuance to it than might have previously been reported. And then she went back to the States and she continued to get theater roles and she traveled. And so I really had a sense that she was someone who had picked up and gone on with her life. And at various stages in her life, she had many things that had happened to her that were difficult along the way, including a fact that her mother was institutionalized when she was 5 after the death of her younger brother. And so she had to deal with emotional abandonment in other aspects of her life. And I felt that was one thing that kind of defined why she wanted to maintain a relationship with Eliot, why she reached out to theater groups and drama clubs in the places she taught. And it also turned out, in addition to be a teacher that her students long admired, she was apparently a pretty good amateur actress. And if you read her reviews, she had a lot of positive reviews. And one of the questions was, why didn't she become a professional actress? And that was something that's sort of open to debate. Some hint that family members discouraged her from doing so. So that was kind of my take on, the kind of person she was. And I also wanted to flesh out who she was as a person so it wouldn't be defined solely, by her relationship with Eliot.
Looking back at the whole relationship that they had through my own modern eyes, I'm looking at this, it's like, he doesn't love you, what are you doing? I mean, if I were just looking at this, it looked pretty cut and dry and pretty clean. However, things were clearly different. I mean, there was to even do an international telephone call wasn't possible. That's why we have all of these letters, let alone going through and, let me just send me an email or just do FaceTime. You couldn't do any of these things.
Right.
It was a very long distance, and you were able to kind of manage the expectations throughout the book. When did you see that changing people's expectations was going to be necessary?
When I wrote my first book and had conversations with book clubs of women, and some said, I got really mad at her that she didn't walk away. And so some people may have that kind of reaction. your comment about technology was interesting. I was fascinated, and I'd love to kind of go back and do some more reporting about the cost of communication in those days. One of the things that was fascinating about Eliot when he was writing to her, he was really obsessed by the which ships were going to the United States and which was the fastest, and trying to get a letter on that ship so it would get to her sooner. One of the things that amazed me is it appears that Eliot may have written his sister and Emily Hale letters telling them that he was remarrying, but they seem to have arrived exactly the day the news broke in the papers. And it's kind of like, how could you have been so confident about International Postal Service back then? But throughout their letters are sprinkled things like, don't send me a cable, it's too expensive, you don't have the money. And then, when they were he was in the United States, they could start to afford long-distance phone calls. But again, a transcontinental long-distance phone call was still an expensive thing. Yeah. And then, later on, traveling to visit each other, and the shift from going by ship or going by airplane comes along. And, Eliot, he would say, oh, when you fly, you got to, I'm going to check you into a hotel because you're going to have a day to recover from the ardors of that trip. So it was just, interesting how all of that interaction has changed so much over our lifetimes.
That interaction seemed to go through at least the first 2/3 of the book. He was constantly worried about, oh, well, you've done two things at once. You better relax. You can't do that sort of thing. Do you think that was of the day or of the people of his stature, the way he would look upon a relationship, or was that just particularly T.S. Eliot?
Well, I think a little bit of both. He was sort of known as a hypochondriac, and so when he expressed concerns about Hale's health and all, you didn't know, did she really have problems, or was he projecting problems onto her? And occasionally, as I delved into this, I found instances where I don't think she told him that she had a health problem because she didn't want him fretting about it. And I think people threw around terms like nervous breakdown much more casually, particularly about women in that time and day. And so he would be telling people she had a nervous breakdown, and meanwhile she would be busily acting or making arrangements of where they were going to meet when he came back to the States. So I kind of questioned, how incapacitated was she at the time? And so that's sort of the challenge with reading Hale's life through Eliot's letters. You have to, read it and kind of understand these nuances to it in terms of if that's going to be the real story.
And I was going to ask, how did you make those distinctions? Because even reading the letters and in your descriptions of her as well as the letters, it seems like she was very well accomplished. I don't think she was a minor league kind of player and a teacher and a director. She didn't write plays herself, but she acted, and she was very successful as a director. But the visions, of course, are coming through T.S. Eliot. How did you manage that process?
Yeah. Occasionally, Eliot would put something in quotes in his letter back to her. And so you figured when he put it in quotes, that might have been something she had actually said. Going back to the theater work, you learn from the letters that she actually gave him a lot of advice when he shifted to playwriting in the 1930s. And he actually made a comment of, I want to write plays because I want to impress you. As time went on, and he was drawing more from their own experience, and I think also gaining more confidence as a playwright. And then, frankly, people started going to his plays, I think, in part because T.S. Eliot's name was associated with it. He did not show her his scripts as early as he had when he was first starting out. I think that she probably found it very emotionally satisfying to sit in this garden behind the place that she stayed when she came to England in the summertime, and talk about plays and help him work through his problems. And they had some of the same kind of tension that any creative couple does. How is he going to take my criticism, and how do I deliver this? And him, not wanting to show her things until he thought it was ready. And so some of that comes through, and I think is also kind of an interesting aspect of their relationship. But, she liked to try writing, and she occasionally would send him something, and she tried her hand at, poetry. She'd send it out with her Christmas cards and all. And it was it was funny because, Eliot was an editor and a critic, and he would try to, gently say, oh, this is great, but then it's got all these problems, and you sort of find that, after he delivered that message, she sometimes would wait a long time before she sent him something else.
How do you feel about selecting Hale? What drew you into her and her story?
Well, initially, as I described, it was, this sheer curiosity about what the story was, and I thought it would make a compelling story because of the highs and lows and twists and turns.
But what kept you going?
What kept me going was, I think, the desire to try and set the record straight. I mean, I had made some errors in my book. Some of the earlier biographies had been wrong. I found, even as people were continuing to write about Hale, they were making errors about her past. Just one example, when Robert Crawford's biography was reviewed in 2022, a British reviewer said that Hale had attended a handful of undistinguished New England colleges, not attended, but taught it, excuse me. And I'm thinking, okay, we're talking about Smith, we're talking about Simmons University. She also taught at Scripps College in California. And so again, this was, people make easy mistakes based on the previous record. And so I thought, I want to devote a book specifically to her. I'm not going to deal with the topic that others will about the impact she had on Eliot's poetry. I'm not qualified to do that, but I can do the research to try to set the record straight. And people may come along after me and find some errors that I've made, but that's part of the process of biography and history. People build on what somebody else has done before them.
And have you taken a trip to England yourself in the course of writing this book? Did you follow any leads directly, any direct reporting?
In 2022, I attended the annual Eliot Summer School, which that summer was held at the University of London. It was held at Oxford last year. And during that, it's bookended by a trip to Little Gidding, which was the subject of one of Eliot's 4 quartets. And then we also made a trip to Burnt Norton. Okay. And it was nice. You could sit out in the gardens, and I remember listening to the bird calls and thinking, can I capture these on my smartphone? Because I'd like to check it out with the Cornell ornithology lab, or someone who knows more about birds, and say, are these the same birds that Eliot put into the poem? But it's a place where you can sit there and I think feel the spirit of Eliot, but I didn't feel Emily Hale's spirit communing with me then. I think Burnt Norton represented more to Eliot than it did to Hale in the end. And although he called it his love poem to her, she was a little bit mystified that it was a love poem. But where I did feel Emily Hale's spirit was when I went to the Pabst Theater in Milwaukee.
Okay.
And she had performed there, and she had performed in a performance of a play called Miss Lulabet by Zona Gale, which was the first play written by a woman to win the Pulitzer Prize. And Zona Gale was in the audience and praised her performance. And so I thought, yeah, it's in a theater setting where I can feel Emily Hale talking to me.
Do you hope to, you're a fan of the written word. Do you hope that this goes into other areas as well? Would you like to see this as a documentary, a film, or?
I'd love to see a Netflix series that would be, even if it was based on Eliot's relationships with all the women, in his life. I think it would make an interesting series. I think when you write a nonfiction book, sort of one of my dreams is to get cited in somebody else's book. That makes you feel good. And I've been very lucky, and one of the reasons I kept at this, frankly, was a lot of people in the Eliot scholarly community have given me encouragement and have told me, when my book came out, that I had a lot of new details. And so I've been lucky in that I've had opportunities to contribute articles to scholarly journals about Eliot, and I always kind of look for what's a place in which I could take some of my research, sometimes things that I didn't have room for in the book, and repurpose it to continue to share some of the things I've learned about her.
Well, Sara Fitzgerald, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Rod.